Today we're going to talk about not just stitching techniques, but everything that happens before you start stitching. So, quick look at the equipment that I tend to use, which is you'll want a sharp pair of snips and somewhere to put your needles. Sometimes I will use a needle keeper magnet on my piece, otherwise just a pin cushion will do nicely. This one even attaches to my scissors. And then a variety of needles depending on what you like, as well as sometimes pins can be very helpful, even in embroidery, for marking out where I want things to go. My favorite type of needle is this one, which is a number 28 tapestry needle. They're blunt, although at this size it'll still hurt if I stab myself with it. So they're less likely to split either my threads that I'm working with or the threads of my fabric. I will work with 28 most commonly, but sometimes a 26 or 24. Later on I'm going to be using actually a darning needle, which will work just fine because I want to work with a heavier thread. So the most important thing to remember when choosing your thread and your needle is, can you thread your needle? Can you pull your threaded needle through the fabric? If so, you're fine. But having some place to put your needles and thread is great. You'll also want a pair of sharp snips. You may or may not like thimbles, so I will sometimes stitch with a thimble when I'm working with something that needs a little bit more oomph. I have two needles that I typically work with. One fits perfectly when my hands are a little cooler, but the other one is for when my hands are a little bit damp or warm and they get swollen. So I have two different sizes actually, depending on the fit that I need. So when one falls off, the other one goes on. And that's pretty much all you need. Sometimes we'll work with stitch marking, markers, ink pens, and I don't necessarily recommend it, but I will use a pencil because I am indecisive about where I want to stitch, so I like to be able to remove it later. So next, let's talk about the threads. I just have a couple of selections of thread here so that we can talk about different threads and needles. This is a silky machine thread, but it works really nicely and has a lovely variegated pattern. We're going to talk about cutting direction in a moment. This is about equal to 2 strands of DMC cotton, which there's nothing wrong with. And then we have some plain as well as variegated 6-stranded thread. And then I don't remember what number this is, probably an 8. Pearl cotton, which I'll be using later. So when you're cutting your threads, you want to always have a manageable length, which for me, I can't fit my whole forearm in here, is usually no longer than the length of my forearm plus maybe half again. Part of the reason for this is that you don't want to have extra thread going through the fabric and possibly degrading, but also you don't want to be pulling it and getting it knotted because fabric or thread will twist a lot as you work with it. So ideally you want to not have too long a length. The other thing that I would like to talk about is with variegateds especially, you can see that if I pull a length, one end is not going to be the same as the other because it's variegated. This is actually going to be very helpful in our next part, which is cutting direction of thread. So when the two lengths are different, if I cut them and I'll see that one end is lighter than the other, and then if I were to continue on once I've used those pieces, this end will be darker and maybe the next end will be lighter. You always want to thread from the end that you have cut, which will also be the end with the nicest, freshest cut thread ends, whereas the end that's been hanging out for a while will sometimes get a little fluffy and it's harder to thread the needle. So why not do that? And then also, when I'm using these kind of bobbins, I'll snug that back in there so that it doesn't untangle more. Then with a stranded thread, let's get these other ones out of the way. Actually want to do this from the slightly fluffier end. Importantly, you want to separate your threads one at a time. So rather than trying to untwist them, open it up a little bit, grab one thread, pull the whole thing out, and it kind of pulls this together, straighten it out, you're grand. Same again. No matter how many strands you're working with, always do them one at a time so that they separate cleanly and untwist. Then I'll wrap that around my bobbin in a moment. Then I can line these up together. Again, really easy to see when I'm working with a variegated, harder to see when I'm working with a plain. When you can get your eyes a little closer, or if you're wearing what I call eyes, magnetic vision enhancement, then you'll be able to see your ends a little bit better. So next, let's talk about how to thread a needle. So I have my nice, clean, crisp ends. I'm going to select my needle, my favorites. So I should be able to do this at my arm's length. Hopefully I won't mess that up today. I want to have the ends of the thread nice and sharp so that they are visible if I open my fingers, and then they can be covered by the ends of my fingers. I'll take the end of my needle, butt it up against there, open up my fingers, and that brings those through. Sometimes I'll fluff up the end because I didn't get it quite precise, but that should work reasonably well. Sometimes you will need to get a sharper end if you're rethreading your needle. Best thing to do is always to clip the threads nice and sharp, but otherwise you can fold it over the end of the needle to get a nice crisp edge and then feed that through. So I like to work with a knot. And I know that that's not everyone's cup of tea. Later, let's talk about whether we knot or don't. Depending on whether the back of your work is going to be visible, you will get to decide whether you need a knot in your work. If the back of your work isn't going to be visible, or if heavy knots on the back aren't going to show through, there's no reason to not use knots. However, if you don't want to, you don't have to. We'll talk about that in a moment. So I'm going to show you what the back looks like by doing it on the top rather than flipping this whole mess over. So normally I'd come up from the back to the front. I'll go down in one of the adjacent spots, basically taking a small straight stitch, hook through the strands at the knot, pull that not too tight because this is an open weave, and then I can now go anywhere I like, and that's pretty secure. So how do we see that from the front? Okay, so from the front, take this up. I'm holding onto the knot at the back. Sometimes I can split that open between my fingers. It's a little easier when you can look at the back of your work. And then I'll go down in the next one, find the, there, had to find the split in the back, catch it on my finger, go down the next space, hopefully get this right. Nope. Let's try that again. Excuse me. So, up. I'm going to take this out to the side so that I can find it on my finger. Good. Again, much easier when you can see what you're doing. Down into the next spot between my spread fingers. There we are. And down. So I'll take a little stitch and then I can carry on with my stitching. So let's keep that to the side because I want to talk about how to do it without a knot. In case you're working on, say, black work or something that, like a handkerchief or a shirt or a chemise, where maybe you'll see the back of the work because it's unlined and you might care about that. You can instead work your the back of your thread or the end of your thread into your stitching. So again, I'm going to treat this as though it were the back of my work, and I'm going to leave a tail. Yes, dear. And let's say that I'm going to do a back stitch. So I'll continue my back stitch line along here. The cat demands her attention. I don't like to leave too much of a tail, but you can also always have a longer tail and then cut it short. So a back stitch from the back. We're gonna keep doing here. And so what I might want to do is, here we are, try to get there. Not very elegant at the start. There we go. Okay. And then I'll come back up. Good. And then over here. And I can either twist this around or I can just keep going over my thread. And back here. And over my thread. So we're working this in. Oh gosh, hope I'm coming up in the right spot here. There we are. So normally you'd be looking at the front side of your work so that this end gets worked into the back. Let's see what that looks like. There, only a little bit visible. I should have chosen a darker color, but you can see how there's my back stitch. Would have been much tidier if I were looking at the front of it. And on the reverse side of that, I will work the end in so that it's not going to work loose. It won't be perfect, but it will be nicer than having a knot on the back. And especially if something's going to be worn or used regularly, then you might not want to feel a knot like this.